Christmas. If we haven't met, my name is Joel. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor here at Bridgeway. And man, thanks for braving whatever the heck it is going on outside to be here tonight. I'm so excited that you guys are with us. We love this time of year. And if you haven't been around our church very long, you might not know this, but something we love about our community that we're building here is that we love asking big questions. We love wrestling with the big things that people have been wondering about since there's been people, and bigger questions than who let the dogs out. Like questions like, why are we here? What is it all about? And one of the questions that I want to spend some time thinking through and talking about tonight is a question that's been around since there's been people. When we've looked up into the sky all throughout history, is like, what is God actually like? What is this God, this force of maybe love and logic, or you might think punishment or wrath? Like, what is God like? And people have wrestled with this question forever, and they've come up with lots of different answers. I mean, throughout history, there have been civilizations that have come to really interesting conclusions about what God is like. For example, the ancient Mesopotamians, who were the most highly educated, most highly developed community that was formed in ancient history, they came to the conclusion that there were like multiple gods, like this God who was called Utu, not U2, Utu. And it was like the God of the sun. There was Yam, the God of water. There was El, the father God. But after some time and different civilizations moved around, people don't talk about those gods anymore. There was the ancient Sumerians, and this culture was way before Jesus. And they had many different gods and goddesses. The one I always love to talk about with the Sumerians was the goddess Ninkasi, who is, I'm not making this up, the goddess of beer. And some of you guys are like, oh, tell me more. I will. There's actually some music, some hymns to these ancient lowercase g gods and goddesses. So I want to show you some lyrics from this hymn to Ninkasi. We're not going to sing it because that'd be weird and you guys would all cancel me. But here's what this hymn to Ninkasi was said. It said, and you got to imagine there was probably a beautiful melody here. Ninkasi, you are the one who pours out the filtered beer, probably an IPA, of a collector vat. It is like the joining of the Tigris and the Euphrates. So just a little tip, this is for free. Next time you want to throw a party and you want to get your friends there, tell them, you guys, it's going to be like the joining of the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's going to be so off the hook, right? But nobody talks about Ninkasi anymore. It moves into the human history, into the contemporaries of Jesus of Nazareth, the Greek and Roman gods and goddesses of the time. You hear about Zeus, who is the god of the sky, the god of thunder, unless you're like more of a Marvel movie person. We know that Thor, that's who Thor is, but they didn't really know that. But nobody's really like naming their kids Zeus anymore. That whole thinking passed away. And it's interesting because we can sit here tonight and we can kind of scoff in our modern sensibilities and our modern understandings of, oh, look at these primitive people that didn't understand things about God, and oh, I can't believe them. But I want to lean into that a little bit, because I think that each and every one of us, we're on that same path, intentioned or not, that these ancients who have gone before us are on. Many of us believe in a version of God, a style, a characteristic of who God is that I think can lead us into the wrong direction. We might, years later, generations from now, laugh about it. And I think when it comes to Christmas, I think the story that we're told about who God is through Christmas is so much better than these false half-truth gods that many of us find ourselves following. So I'm going to walk through some of these examples that I know I've seen in my own life, and I think I see in our culture as at large, of these different versions of God that we find ourselves following. And what I'm going to do tonight, and maybe you've never heard a pastor say this before, but if you believe in one of these versions of God, I'm going to ask you to stop believing in God and trust in a better story, a better version of who God really is. The first version of God that I'm going to ask you to stop believing in, and maybe you've fallen into this. Nope, first version of God. Nope, next slide. There we go. The security guard God. The security guard God, this version of God says this, like it's like your bodyguard, your body man, and they say that I'm here to protect you and make sure nothing bad happens to us. And we make a silent bargain with this version of God, this picture of God that we have in our mind. And the silent bargain is this: if I do the right things, if I follow all the religious rules, if I do those things I'm supposed to do, then you're going to protect me, right? And we think that this is the bargain that we set with God, but this doesn't work, does it? And we've all maybe had times in our lives when we've wanted this and we've treated God like he's just our body man, a security guard there to protect us. But still, bad things happen, right? Bad things happen to bad people. Bad things happen to good people. Bad things happen to people. And if we are believing that God, the true version of God, is just this security guard God who's there to protect us, if we strike this silent bargain to do the right thing with him, man, we are just going to be so disappointed. And the reality, if the security guard God was the true version of who God was, then Christianity would have never left the first century. Because all of Jesus' first followers, these brave men and women, they all died gruesomely. Peter, one of his closest disciples, was crucified upside down in Rome because he said that Jesus was Lord. Paul, who wrote 2/3 of our New Testament, was beheaded because he would not refuse to say that Jesus was resurrected. So if the security guard version is the real thing, then we would have never even heard about Jesus today in 2022 in North Central Indiana. I want to encourage you to think differently and maybe believe in a different version of God tonight. Another false little g version of God that I think many of us fall into believing is what we'll call the on-demand God, like the God that you can like stream and pick what you want to watch next, and you don't even have to basically tell it what you want it to do because it's going to keep playing, right? It's like, well, you want to play the next episode? Stop judging me, Netflix. I'm going to watch the next episode, right? But on-demand God is kind of when we treat God like a genie. Like we say like, God, this is what I want, or like Santa Claus, this is what I want, and you're supposed to bring it to me. In other words, and other ways of thinking about this is we think in this version of God that, if I had the powers that this God has, then at least it's a fair and reasonable request for me to ask for something. I mean, I'm not asking for world hunger to end or to world poverty to end. I'm just asking for a date. Or maybe you're a parent here and you're like, oh, I want grandkids someday, so I'm asking for a date for my kid. Like that's like the fair and reasonable things that we might ask for. And we think that God is just there like a vending machine to give us what we want when we want it. But we all have had problems with this. This has failed for us, right? Because every time that we've prayed, maybe fervently, in a real way, we've begged God for something. There are moments when there are breakthrough, and then there are other moments where we just can't quite get our hands around this God. We want to be able to control the outcomes, but we just can't control the outcomes. God is just bigger and beyond maybe what we want in this moment. I think this is actually a good thing that we don't have an on-demand God where we can just treat him like a vending machine. When you think about it, think back when you're 10, 12, 14, 16 years old. Think about your prayer requests. And what if God said yes to everything you prayed for and asked for when you were 12, 14, 16 years old? I know for me, thinking back to middle school, I would have been married to Britney Spears, subsequently divorced from Britney Spears. I would have been traveling in my favorite band at the time, Don't Judge Me, Creed. That would have been terrible. What was going on there? I'm so glad that God did not answer all the prayers and I didn't get the vending machine on-demand version of God. I think we need to lean into the ancient Christian wisdom of the great saint, Saint Garth of Brooks. Said, I thank God for unanswered prayers. Maybe there's more going on to who God really is. There's another version of God I think many of us, we fall into believing, and we'll just call it the goosebumps God. I'm in my feelings God. This is a God that's presence is completely tied to how we feel in those mountaintop moments. The goosebumps God shows up at church camp, shows up at a Hillsong United concert with 20,000 other people singing along with you. It shows up during certain songs, but not in other songs. And we have to feel something emotional, like an emotional high, to feel that God's presence is actually there. But that leads us up for trouble, doesn't it? Because life is not all mountaintop experiences, is it? There are mundane times. There are valley moments. There's low moments. And does that mean that God doesn't care about us in those low moments, in those mundane moments? I don't think that's what we believe. So we chase after our emotions, thinking that we're chasing after God because the goosebumps God is not the real thing. I mean, think of it this way, that you and I, we are the least aware of what's most constant to us. We are least aware of the things that are most constant to us. I know this because I've never sat down in a room with 120 people, and I've sat down in my seat and I thought, the air temperature is just perfect in here. Can you believe how amazing it feels in here? Just perfect. No, what do we feel? We feel like when it's way too hot or it's way too cold. Does it mean that there's an absence of the presence of perfect air sometimes? No, it just means that we're not aware of it. We're least aware of the things that are most constant. So when we chase after the goosebumps God, when it's all about how we feel emotionally, it's going to lead us to a dead end. There's one other version of God I want to encourage us to stop believing in as we lean into the real thing tonight is, let's call it the guilt God. And the guilt God is the God that says, if it feels good, don't do it. This is, especially if it has anything to do with sex. Like the guilt God says, no, this cannot be the right thing. The guilt God wants you to suffer. The guilt God might love you, but he certainly does not like you. I grew up in a faith tradition where sometimes it felt like the guilt God was the one that was on display the most, because sometimes the conversations after the services would be like, oh man, they really got me today. It was a phrase like they were just stepping on my toes. It was making me feel bad, which meant that things were going good, like it was a good sermon if I felt bad. It was just the way that I was brought up. And so where the guilt God was so present, and the guilt God has a wagging finger towards you, and the guilt God wants you to hurt and suffer. And you can follow the guilt God, but you look underneath the hood to your motivation of following the guilt God, and it's that you're afraid. And that is trouble for each and every one of us, because there's got to be a better way to understand God. So the security card God, the on-demand God, the goosebumps God, the guilt God, there's lots of different versions of God, but many of us, when we think about God, we're letting our minds wander to one of these places. And I'm talking about all this at Christmas because one of the most beautiful reasons why Jesus came to planet Earth was to show us a different thing. It was to provide us a new kind of story, to bring us clarity about who God is and how we interact with the divine. I put it this way, that Jesus came to reveal what God is like. If you have questions about what God is like, what's the personality, what's the character, what is he up to, what are the kind of things that make his heart beat out of his chest, what does he want from you and I? Jesus came to reveal exactly that. Jesus' followers in the first century, in multiple different ways, they talked about this reality. Well, look here first in the book of Hebrews. We don't know exactly who wrote the book of Hebrews, but whoever she was brilliant. She said this: the sun is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. The exact representation of his being. Paul, another follower of Jesus, said this to a group of Jesus followers in Colossae: the Son, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. In other words, my friends, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. You want to know what God has to say, listen to Jesus. You want to know what God is up to in this world and what he's inviting you to partner with him, look at Jesus. We've not always known exactly what God is like, but now we do, because God is like Jesus. And Jesus came at Christmas to bring crystal clarity to this question that shapes the trajectory of our lives. What is God really like? It's a beautiful, beautiful reality. So I want to, just for the short amount of time we have together, I want to lean into this reality a little bit more and tease this out to see some of those things that you and we need. I know that I need, that Christmas reveals to us about who God is through Jesus. The first reality I want us to look at is this right here. That Christmas reveals God's posture towards us. When God thinks about you, what does God think about you? When God thinks about you, what's his countenance? What's his posture towards you and I and all of our messy, broken humanity? I think that's a great question for us to ask, because so many of us think that God's angry at us, or waiting for the other shoe to drop and God's going to strike us with something. You know, what's fascinating is when Jesus' friends and his disciples, when they were penning some of the words of our New Testament, they were going through their memories of life with Jesus, their notes about what Jesus said, they described him in so many different ways. His friend John, I want us to look at this not as a Bible verse, but as one of Jesus' friends, John, when he was reminiscing about who Jesus was and what he was like. I love these words that he says at the beginning of his gospel. Jesus' friend John said, the word Jesus became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He became human and he took up residency among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. And Jesus, he was full of grace and truth. When he's reminiscing about who Jesus was, he said that he was full of grace and truth. Now, I've stumbled on this phrase before, and because I've seen this weaponized towards me and other people before. It's this idea of, Jesus is full of grace, but he's also full of the truth. Or Jesus is love, but he's also full of wrath. We got to understand that he's not going to let you slide. He's actually angry at you underneath of it all. But when you look at the first century and the way they understood the truth, it was never used as a hammer to hit you. The best definition I could come up with of what truth was to the author of these words is this right here. This is what truth is. The truth is the actual state of the matter, seeing things for the way they are. No blurry vision, no speck in his eye, just seeing what reality is. My friends, Jesus was full of truth. He sees you the way that you are. Your mountaintop moments, your low moments, the good things you do, the bad things you do, the good things you do with the wrong motivations. He sees the way that things actually are. And that can be a terrifying reality if we don't couple it with the other truth, is that he is full of the truth and of this, of grace. The way I'm learning to understand grace, in this next slide here, is presence not withheld. He saw me, he saw you and all of our mess and all of our pretense and all of our brokenness, but yet he did not withhold his presence from us. The Son was given to us and came into the world for us. Do you know what grace is? This presence not withheld? Grace is the antidote to shame. I remember hearing Brene Brown say this once, that guilt is when you feel bad about something you did, but shame is when you feel like there's something wrong and unlovable about you. Grace, my friends, is the antidote to shame. This Jesus was full of grace and truth. He sees us for how we are, but yet he still came to us. He didn't wait for us to clean ourselves up, but while we were yet messy, broken sinners, he came to us and he sees that we are good and we are worthy of his love. Oh, this reality changes so much for us, that he is full of grace and truth. And yes, the truth includes sin, the terrible decisions we make that harm us and harm other people. But the Father's face towards our sin is not a wagging finger or a lightning bolt in tow, but it's a grieving heart of a father. He says, I believe there's better for you. Trust me and trust in my embrace, my presence not withheld. You know what Christmas reveals? Is that God's posture towards you, yes, you, is grace and truth. He sees you, he knows you, and he embraces you through his love. This proclaims to us, and Christmas proclaims to us, that God makes the first move before we clean ourselves up, my friends. And that's really good news. That's what God is like. Another reality Christmas reveals to us about what God is like is this. Christmas reveals to us that God stands with us through our suffering. In the first century mind, there was this idea that was Platonic from Plato, the philosopher, and it was this Gnostic heresy and teaching that was going around that if you were to be divine, if you were to be holy, if you were to be noble, you never experienced pain and suffering. Pain and suffering was not something for the divine and for the noble, and yet look at the life of Jesus, my friends. It was full of the same kind of pains and suffering that you and I have and do experience all the time. Jesus felt rejection in his life. He went to his hometown and he was rejected in his hometown from people that grew up with him. Jesus felt loss and experienced grief and mourning and lament when his close friend Lazarus died way before his time, and Jesus screamed out in agony and wept for his friend. Jesus felt betrayal not only from Judas, but from Peter, who denied even knowing him. And Jesus ultimately experienced the sting of death. And he even stood in solidarity with us as he was killed by brutal capital punishment. Jesus was this God who said, I'm going to stand in suffering and stand with people through suffering. I'm going to know what it feels like. In one of his teachings, he's telling his disciples near the end of his ministry what was coming down the pike after he was gone. And he said things are going to be really hard. And he's trying to pump them up, but it was kind of a terrible pep talk. And in the middle of this beautifully terrible pep talk that Jesus is giving his disciples, he says these words that maybe you've heard before. He says this: in this world, you will have trouble. How's that for a Christmas message of hope, right? In your life, things will stink. Things will be terrible sometimes. You will have trouble. It's a promise from the mouth of Jesus. But he continues and said, but take heart, have courage. I have overcome the world. I'm coming to understand there's a beautiful reality found in this ancient Christian stream that we're trying to swim in, is that Christianity does not eject you from suffering and pain. It doesn't help you get around suffering and pain and numb down suffering and pain. But something about walking with this Jesus gets you through suffering and pain, gets you to the other side. Jesus, in some way, says the answer to the reason that we hurt and we suffer, the answer to our suffering is his witness. And I know that's not a word, but think about it. His witness, he is with us, and that's what changes the game. Now, I know so many of us, we're walking through this Christmas holiday season when everywhere we go, we can't, not hear that stinking Mariah Carey song that just won't stop. We hear all the songs that lead us to feel like we should have a painted plastic smile on our face, but many of us, it just doesn't work for us anymore, right? Because there's real stuff and real pain going on underneath the surface. I think what Jesus shows us is that he's well acquainted with what's going on, and he'll walk with us through our suffering. I love what Meredith Miller, a great Bible teacher and writer, she says this: Christmas is not here to offer a 4-week escape from the pain of the world with a paper-thin layer of twinkle lights. Christmas is not here to numb us with bows and eggnog lattes. Christmas is not offering us the chance to escape the ache of life through piles of presents. Christmas isn't here for all this. She continues and says this: Christmas is God saying, yes, this pain is too much. Yes, it's just all too sad. Yes, the ache is too great. Hang on, and I'll come and carry it with you. It's the witness that changes the game. My friends, Christmas reveals to us a God who suffers alongside of us. And this moves me deeply emotionally. It satisfies me deeply emotionally. Maybe not intellectually in the middle of those terrible seasons that we face together, but it just reaches the deepest recesses of my soul, and it comforts me in an amazing way. That this is a God who says, I'll come and carry it with you. Again, this doesn't answer the question. A great question that I get asked a lot as a pastor, and I'm sure that you've asked before or heard people wrestle with, is how could a good God allow bad things to happen to good people if he loved them, right? And this doesn't intellectually circle every square in that question. But I'll tell you, when you ask that question, how can a good God allow bad things to happen to me or to good people? I don't have that pat answer to give you. I don't have the tweet shareable meme-worthy thing, and don't believe anybody who stands on stage that does and tells you that. But I'll tell you, it can't mean that he doesn't love us. It can't mean that he doesn't care about what's going on in our lives. I love what pastor and author Tim Keller says about this. It can't mean that. He says this: the answer to that question, it can't be that God is indifferent or detached from our pain. God takes our misery and suffering so seriously, he was willing to take it on himself. When you cry, my friends, God is crying there with you. When you fall to your knees, he is right there with you. He knows it, and he's walked with it. And Christmas reveals to us a God who's not too big and mighty to get down in the muck of our hurt and our pain with us. One more thing today. What Christmas reveals to us about what God is like, we'll put it this way. Christmas reveals to us that God is one who limits and lowers himself to reach us. Christmas reveals that God is one who limits and lowers himself to reach us. An early song that was sung in small gatherings of Jesus followers in the first century. It's recorded for us in Paul's letter to the church in Philippi called Philippians. And I want us to, again, not see this as some like memory verses, Bible verses, but think of this as a truth around a poem and song that Jesus followers would gather around and look each other in the eyes and lift each other up with. This song says this, that Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. And that first sentence there, it's really clear, like this belief is that Jesus is God, and being in the very nature God, being like he is made of the stuff that God is. He's not like a good holy man, but being in the very nature God, this is who Jesus was. What did he do with that? He didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. He emptied himself by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And if we're thinking of it as a song, nothing rhymes, but it's not in English. I need to remember that all the time. But he made himself nothing. That phrase, made himself nothing, it's from the Greek word kenosis, kenao, which is the idea of emptying out something. Don't miss this, my friends. Like Jesus, when he came here, the arrival of Jesus, the first Christmas, the eternal Son of God, he made himself vulnerable. He made himself have a need. He emptied himself of his divine privileges to stand in solidarity and to understand you and I. He made himself have a need. He made himself vulnerable. Over the last 2.5 weeks, I've felt pretty vulnerable. I've had a need. I bought a new to me car that was a scorching great deal, and then 6 days later, the transmission failed. And no, it's all good, guys, because I got my Granny Mobile back today, and everything's working with a new to me transmission. But anyway, for 2.5 weeks, I have had to bum rides off of coworkers. I have driven my wife's minivan more than I ever imagined. I've taken a 15-minute walk to a coffee shop, and it started raining about 2 minutes into my walk. And like all these kind of moments where I felt vulnerable, I've been like, in my breath and everything. And I felt like I've had a need. And isn't it true? Like something about us in our human nature, we love to be independent. None of us want to have to ask for help and have to have need. One of the beautiful truths of Christmas and the arrival of Jesus and what it reveals to us about what God is like is that he chose to limit himself and have need. He was always the most important person in every room he ever walked into, but he never clung to his divine privileges at all. Jesus allowed himself to need. Think of it this way. The one who spoke oceans into existence went thirsty and asked for a drink. The one who caused the seed to sprout went hungry and needed food. The one who caused the rocks to form likely scraped his knee on some stone. One other way to say this is this. At Christmas, the infinite God became a helpless infant. He limited himself and he lowered himself. You just got to think about the way that he came into the world in a very real and raw way. He came through the vulnerability of childbirth. Think of all the ways that God could have shown up on the scene and make the big announcement, here I am. He came through the vulnerability of childbirth. What does it say about a God who arrives through the frailty of human childbirth, who's willing to come into this world through a statistical risk of childbearing? What does it say about a God who's willing to be attached by a placenta for nourishment and life to its own creation? What does it say about a God who's willing to wait and grow in a human womb for the same amount of time that you and I had to grow and wait in a human womb? Christmas reveals this God who limits and lowers himself and reveals that God will go the distance all the way to know us and to stand in solidarity with us. And this knocks me out. The poetry alone knocks me out. So what I want to do with the remaining time we have together is during this message is I just want to help us try to see in a bigger way, a clearer picture about who this God is. I want to invite you to join in the spirit of the shepherds that night of the arrival of Jesus, these outcasts who were out in the hills that nobody wanted to spend time with, but God shows up and announces to them, you've got to go check out this newborn king. And they were struck with a certain kind of spirit. I want us to join in with the spirit of the Magi, these like pagan people from the east who were always following stars, even though there's like 14 different places in the Old Testament where we're not supposed to look at stars, but God graciously invites them into the story to reveal who he is to them. And I think it struck up a certain spirit, and I want to invite you to join them in the spirit of a couple ways. First is this, is wonder. Oh man, I pray that this Christmas season, this evening, that you are struck with childlike, wide-eyed wonder at the divine mystery that we're uncovering together. Life has a way, as you become an adult, of kicking the wonder out of you. Life has a way of desensitizing that word awesome, and we say awesome about everything, right? But this, my friends, the arrival of Jesus and who he is, it is truly awesome, and it strikes us with wonder. I pray that it leads you to like, how could this divine mystery be? I pray it strikes up this spirit that I'm sure the shepherds and Magi had as well. It struck up a spirit of affection. Like your heart, like the Grinch, it grew 3 times in 3 sizes or whatever. But in light of this love that sees you and knows the truth about you and does not withhold its presence, in light of this love that walks with you through your dark moments, your low moments, and your mountaintop moments, how can we not be a bug to a light and open up our hearts to share back of the love that we feel for this good God? Oh, I pray it stirs your affections this Christmas season. And lastly, I pray it leads you to a place and a posture of devotion. I pray that it leads you to a place and a posture of, yes, God, this is who you are. The answer is yes. I don't care what the question is. I pray that this God revealed to us at Christmas leads you to a place where you don't just intellectually in your mind believe, yeah, Jesus came, yeah, this happened, but it moves to your hands and it moves to your heart to where you're not satisfied with just agreeing with this God, but you want to be on mission with this God. You want to partner with this God and be up to whatever he's up to in this world. And you'll say yes before you know the question. A wonder of this mystery, this affection and devotion. Oh man, that is my prayer for us this Christmas season. Because Jesus is what God's like. Jesus is what God has to say. And this Jesus has come low for you and for me and those outside of these walls, those who don't believe that a church would ever make a space for them. He came low for them too.